from the pulpit. And again, we look forward to the 1 o'clock classified briefing. We're going to have to hustle. The committee now stands adjourned. Thank you.
We're done here. Are we going to the classified briefing?
We are.
Okay. Do you know what room the briefing's in? Oh.
Eliza Johnson was 54 years old and an invalid when she was thrust into the role of First Lady, determined to be a helpmate to her husband Andrew Johnson as he navigated the turbulent end to the Civil War, Reconstruction in the South, and his own impeachment. Eliza Johnson, this Sunday night at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN's original series, First Ladies, Influence and Image, examining the public and private lives of the women who filled the position of First Lady and their influence on the presidency. From Martha Washington to Michelle Obama, Sundays at 8 p.m. Eastern on American History TV on C-SPAN 3.
Defense Secretary Ash Carter and Joint Chiefs Chair Martin Dempsey testified this morning before the House Armed Services Committee. Chairman Mac Thornberry says he planned to ask Secretary Carter and General Dempsey questions about the military component of U.S. strategy to reverse the downward spiral in the Middle East and protect American interests. General Dempsey is finishing a 4-year stint as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The White House announced last week that the U.S. would send up to 450 troops to a new base in Anbar province in western Iraq, mainly to advise the Iraqis on planning and execution of a counteroffensive to retain Ramadi, their provincial capital. General Dempsey has said that more such U.S. hubs could be opened elsewhere in Iraq as the campaign advances. Live coverage here from Capitol Hill on C-SPAN 3.
Secretary, don't you think there's no military solution here? Don't you think we should end these wars? No more army in Iraq. Let's stop this. Committee is on order. Before we proceed, I want to make clear up front that the committee will not tolerate disturbances in these proceedings, including verbal disruptions, photography, standing or holding signs. And I want to thank all our guests at the outset for your cooperation. This committee meets today to hear from the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on U.S. policy and strategy in the Middle East. I think we should acknowledge at the outset that this region is not subject to easy or simple solutions and has bedeviled statesmen of many countries for generations. Yet there is also a sense that we're at a particularly perilous time and that the U.S. policy and strategy is inadequate. Dr. Kissinger testified earlier this year before the Senate that in the Middle East, multiple upheavals are unfolding simultaneously. There's a struggle for power within states, a contest between states, a conflict between ethnic and sectarian groups, and an assault on the international state system. He further argued that especially in a time of global upheaval, the consequences of American disengagement is greater turmoil. It seems to me that that is what we are in fact witnessing. While President Obama admitted recently that there is not a complete strategy for dealing with ISIS, others argue that there may well be a strategy at work here, one of retrenchment and accommodation so that the U.S. plays a lesser role in the Middle East and elsewhere. U.S. military personnel are the most capable in the world, but I know of no one who thinks that 450 more in Iraq under current constraints will turn the tide against ISIS. Very concerning to me are recent press reports that in the midst of negotiations to remove sanctions related to its nuclear program, Iran is continuing to pay and equip the Taliban in Afghanistan as part of its regional efforts to sow instability and harm U.S. interests. When one factors in the chaos in Yemen and Syria, the uncertainty about the future direction of Turkey, the doubts about us from traditional allies such as Egypt and the Gulf nations, as well as the continuing threats to our ally Israel, the plain hard facts show that the situation in the Middle East has deteriorated substantially in the last 6 years. What's worse, there seems to be nothing coming from the White House to change that trajectory. We cannot expect our distinguished witnesses today to answer for all the failures of the administration's approach to the Middle East over the last 6 years. We can and should expect, however, to hear the military component of a strategy to reverse this deteriorating trend and to protect American interests. My view is that there is no substitute for American leadership in the Middle East or anywhere else. That does not mean it's up to us to solve age-old disputes, but it does mean we cannot afford, for our own sake, to simply stand back. We must be strong, especially militarily strong, and we must be credible. Yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs for joining us today and for their great work for our country. And I think the Chairman in his first couple of sentences there adequately described the depth of the problem. With the number of failed states and, gosh, just the different battles that are going on there, it is an overwhelming problem that is creating a huge humanitarian crisis and a threat not just to the region, but to the globe. I will, however, disagree that the notion that a U.S. presence will solve the problem. I would hope that we would have learned over the course of the last 14 years of having a substantial U.S. presence in both Iraq and Afghanistan, that the West showing up in the Muslim world and saying we're here to solve your problems isn't going to get it done. And as far as the strategy is concerned, I believe we do have a strategy. I think what people are frustrated by is that strategy, that U.S. strategy, does not simply solve the problem. And I've had a number of people complain to me about our lack of a strategy. I've asked every single one of them, okay, what should we do? Have not got an answer as to what we should do that would solve the complex problems that the Chairman described. So as we approach this, I hope that we are cautious about our confidence that U.S. military might can solve this problem, because I think that would make it worse and at great cost to us. What we have to do is tactically use the U.S. military to help the right people and move things in the right direction, not think that the more U.S. military we use, somehow the better the situation gets. I think that would be a very, very dangerous mistake. As far as the broader strategy, it's really simple on its face. We need to find Sunnis who are willing and able to fight ISIS and build a better alternative. And it's not just ISIS. I mean, if ISIS went away tomorrow, there would be another ideologically extremist violent group, just like, it was Al-Qaeda, still is, but now ISIS has seemingly eclipsed Al-Qaeda. It's not just a matter of defeating one group. It's a matter of defeating an ideology. Now, the one thing I will quibble with, and that I do want to hear from our two witnesses about our strategy, is in getting those Sunnis that would be willing to fight ISIS and present a more reasonable alternative in Iraq and Syria, certainly, but elsewhere as well, for the people over there, we are still relying on the Baghdad government. It is still our hope that there will be an Iraqi government that is sufficiently inclusive so that Sunnis will be willing to fight for it. I just don't see that happening. Starting with al-Maliki, they set up a very sectarian separatist government that did everything to shove the Sunnis into the arms of ISIS. Now, I've not met al-Badi, but I have heard that he has a desire to change that. The trouble is the people below him have no desire to change that. And he does not have the power simply to make them, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Interior, the various Shia militias, Iran, change their minds. So as we continue to try and do that, I fear that strategy won't work. Now, I know why we do it, because what's the alternative? How do we offer the Sunnis, a reasonable place to be if they don't have some support from Baghdad? But I think we need to start thinking about it. I think we need to put a lot of pressure on our Gulf allies, like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, to say, look, these are your people. The Baghdad government has abandoned them. You don't want ISIS to be the alternative. What can you do to encourage the tribes in Syria and Iraq to turn on ISIS? It's not easy. And again, I'll just close by saying, we could drop 200,000 U.S. troops in the middle of this. It wouldn't solve the problem. And I sincerely hope we've learned that lesson, and then we don't go deeper and deeper into that, costing more lives and more treasure while only making the problem worse. Because the bottom line is, for all of their faults and failings, the one dependable argument that groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS have with the Muslim world is to stand up and say, we are defending the Muslim world against Western aggression. That is a message that has widespread support, far more support, certainly, than the violent psychopathic groups that espouse it. We cannot contribute to that. We've got to find a way to build partnerships. This has to be locally driven by Sunnis in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere to eject ISIS, to eject that ideology, and build a better future for their people. And that is no easy task, I understand. But I do look forward to the testimony and the questions, and hopefully we can learn more about how to go about being part of that solution. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Without objection, your complete written statements will be made part of the record. Again, thank you both for being here. Ms. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, all members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. Thank you also for keeping a wide-ranging and long-term perspective on the challenges and opportunities for America and its leadership around the world. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Singapore, Vietnam, and India, and next week I'll be in Germany, Estonia, and Belgium for a NATO ministerial. I understand that your focus in this hearing is current developments in the Middle East. I'd be happy to answer questions about anything else. The Middle East, as the chairman noted, is undergoing a period of great social and political turmoil with a number and variety of cross-cutting geopolitical developments. Our strategy in the region, America's strategy, is grounded in America's core national interests. That's the foundation. Tailored to address specific circumstances in specific and various places, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and so forth. And it leverages American leadership with the efforts of a coalition of allies and partners. Our core interests, for example, drive our actions to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Similarly, they dictate that we not let up until we have destroyed ISIL and al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists throughout the region that pose dangers to...
The chair notes there's a disturbance in the committee's proceedings. The committee will be in order. Pardon the interruption, Mr. Secretary. Please proceed.
Similarly, our core interests dictate that we not let up until we have destroyed ISIL and al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists throughout the region that pose dangers to the homeland, to friends, and to allies. The past few weeks serve as a reminder to terrorists bent on harming the United States and our interests, whether they're in Libya, Syria, or Yemen, that we have the capability to reach out and strike them. Meanwhile, the security of Israel will always be one of my top priorities. And the chairman just returned from Israel this past weekend. And we'll continue to hone important security relationships with our partners in the Gulf, bolster their security, and ensure freedom of navigation there. The pursuit of our nation's core interests in the region is a strategy based on tireless diplomacy, backed by formidable military power and dedicated capacity building to buttress and leverage the contributions of others, and especially, as noted, those in the region themselves. That's why we have 35,000 forces postured throughout the region, enabling us to strike ISIL and al-Qaeda terrorists and check Iranian malign influence. That's why we're assuring Israel's continued qualitative military edge, and why we're working with our Gulf partners to make them more capable of defending themselves against external aggression. That's why we're supporting Saudi Arabia in protecting its territory and people from Houthi attacks, and supporting international efforts to prevent Iranian shipments of lethal equipment from reaching Houthi and Salah-affiliated forces in Yemen. And that's why the United States is supporting efforts to pursue political settlements to crises throughout the region, from Yemen to Libya to Syria. While I'm prepared for a range of questions related to DoD's role in the Middle East, I'd like to focus on the immediate issue that I understand the committee is interested in, namely the U.S.-led coalition's strategy to defeat ISIL. ISIL presents a grave threat to our friends and allies in the Middle East, elsewhere around the world, from Africa and Europe to parts of Asia, because of its steady metastasis, and to our homeland because of its avowed intentions to strike and recruit in this country. ISIL must be and will be dealt a lasting defeat. The strategy to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIL, constructed by President Obama, draws upon all the national security agencies of the U.S. government: intelligence, law enforcement, diplomacy, and others. The strategy and its associated military campaign also involve a global coalition, reflecting both the worldwide consensus on the need to counter this threat and the practical requirement for others to do their part. And the counter-ISIL strategy has nine so-called lines of effort, reflecting the breadth of this challenge and the tools needed to combat it. The first and most critical line of effort is the political one, which is led by the State Department. In Iraq, this involves building more effective, inclusive, and multi-sectarian governance. Each of the other lines of effort requires success in this line because it's the only way to create support among local forces and local people. That support being necessary to make progress against extremism stick. The next two lines of effort are interconnected: to deny ISIL safe haven and to build partnership capacity in Iraq and Syria. Both are led by the Department of Defense, which, alongside coalition partners, is conducting a bombing campaign from the air, advising and assisting Iraqi security forces on the ground, and training and equipping trusted local forces. I will address our military's current execution of these two lines of effort in a moment, but I want to underscore a crucial point about our campaign in Iraq and also Syria. It requires capable, motivated, legitimate local ground forces to seize, clear, and hold terrain. That's the only way to ensure a truly lasting, enduring defeat of this movement. The fourth line of effort is enhancing intelligence collection on ISIL, which is led by the National Counterterrorism Center. The fifth line of effort, which is disrupting ISIL's finances, a vital task, is co-led by Treasury and State. Lines of Effort 6 and 7, both co-led by State and the National Counterterrorism Center, are to counter ISIL's messaging and to disrupt the flow of foreign fighters to and from ISIL, both of which are critical in today's connected and networked world. The 8th line of effort, providing humanitarian support to those displaced by or vulnerable to ISIL, is led by State. And finally, the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI are working together to protect the homeland, the 9th so-called line of effort, by disrupting terrorist threats here. The effective execution of all 9 of these lines of effort by the United States and its coalition partners is plainly necessary to ensure overall success. Let me turn to the execution of DoD's 2 lines of effort, beginning with the U.S.-led campaign of airstrikes against ISIL in Iraq and Syria. This effort has produced some clear results in limiting ISIL's freedom of movement, constraining its ability to reinforce its fighters, and impeding its command and control. It has enabled some key achievements for local forces, including the very recent success of anti-ISIL forces who took the key town of Tal Abyad. The strikes are also buying critical time and space to carry out DoD's 2nd line of effort, which is developing the capacity and capabilities of legitimate local forces. The ground campaign is a work in progress. The Iraqi security forces were severely degraded after Mosul fell last June, when 4 divisions dissolved. The combination of disunity, deserters, and so-called ghost soldiers who are paid on the books but don't show up or don't exist had greatly diminished their capacity. However, understanding these challenges does not change reality. ISIL's lasting defeat still requires local forces to fight and prevail on the ground. We can and will continue to develop and enable such local forces because we know from experience that putting U.S. combat troops on the ground as a substitute for local forces will not produce enduring results. That's why DoD seeks to bolster Iraq's security forces to be capable of winning back and then defending and holding the ISIL-controlled portions of the Iraqi state. What we saw in Ramadi last month was deeply disappointing and illustrated the importance of a capable and motivated Iraqi ground force. In the days that followed, all of us on the President's national security team, at his direction, took another hard look at our campaign across all 9 lines of effort. At DoD, I convened my team before, during, and after my trip to the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean region to examine our execution of DoD's lines of effort and prepare options for the President if his approval was required for any enhancements we identified. In our meetings at both the White House and the Pentagon, we determined that while we have the right strategic framework, execution of the campaign can and should be strengthened, especially on the ground. We determined that our training efforts could be enhanced and thus are now focusing on increasing participation in and throughput of our training efforts, working closely with the Iraqi government and stressing the focus on drawing in Sunni forces, which, as noted, are underrepresented in the Iraqi security forces today. We also determined that our equipping of the Iraqi security forces had proceeded too slowly. This process was earlier, sometimes delayed by bureaucracy in Baghdad, but also in Washington. That's why we're now expediting delivery of essential equipment and material like anti-tank capabilities and counter-IED equipment to the Iraqi security forces, including Kurdish and Sunni tribal forces. We also determined that we could enable Iraqi security forces with more tailored advice and assistance, including with critical outreach to Sunni communities. That's why, on advice from Chairman Dempsey and General Austin and at my recommendation, last week President Obama authorized the deployment of 450 personnel to Iraq's Takata military base in Anbar province to establish an additional site where we could advise and assist the Iraqi security forces. Situated between Ramadi and Fallujah, Taqadum is a key location for engaging Sunni tribes, and Prime Minister Abadi, Iraqi military officials, and Sunni leaders have all committed to using Taqadum to reinvigorate and expedite the recruitment of Sunni fighters. Our forces will also provide much-needed operational advice and planning support to the Iraqi Security Forces Anbar Operations Center, which is also located at Taqadum. We expect that this move will open a new dimension in our and Iraq's efforts to recruit Sunnis into the fight and to help the Iraqis coordinate and plan the critical effort to roll back ISIL in Anbar province. And Secretary Kerry and I have agreed to begin a process of continually assessing the execution of our campaign, starting with improving coordination across our respective lines of effort. Execution, however, is a two-way street, and our training efforts in Iraq have thus far been slowed by a lack of trainees. We simply haven't received enough recruits. Of the 24,000 Iraqi security forces we had originally envisioned training at our 4 sites by this fall, we've only received enough recruits to be able to train about 7,000, in addition to 2,000 counterterrorism service personnel. As I've told Iraqi leaders, while the United States is open to supporting Iraq more than we already are, we must see a greater commitment from all parts of the Iraqi government. There are positive signs. I've met with Prime Minister Abadi, Iraqi Kurdistan Regional President Barzani, and just last week with Speaker Jabouri of Iraq's parliament. They all fully understand the need to empower more localized, multi-sectarian Iraqi security forces and address persistent organization and leadership failures. And because a sovereign, multi-sectarian Iraq is more likely to ensure a lasting defeat of ISIL, the United States must continue working with and through the Iraqi government in all our actions, including our support for Kurdish and Sunni tribal forces. Our efforts need to reinforce inclusivity and multi-sectarianism, not fuel a reversal to sectarianism, which would make the lasting defeat of ISIL harder, not easier. The situation in Syria is even more complex because of the lack of a legitimate government partner and many competing forces there. Regardless, we will continue striking ISIL in Syria with the long reach of our airstrikes and operators. We will continue working with Syria's neighbors to impede the flow of foreign fighters into and out of Syria and Iraq. Our train and equip mission in Syria has been challenging, but the requirement for a capable and motivated counter-ISIL ground force there also means we must persist in our efforts. In conclusion, I believe that success in this campaign can and must be assured. It will take time and require consistent effort on everyone's part, the entire U.S. government, our entire international coalition, and most importantly, the Iraqi and Syrian peoples. Together, and with your support, including your support for America's troops and their families, for which I and they are ever grateful, we will achieve ISIL's lasting defeat. Be happy to address your questions.
Thank you. General Dempsey, you have already had a number of interactions with this committee in the first 6 months of this year, for which we are very grateful, and that's the reason, as I told you before the hearing, I'm not going to say goodbye to you, even though the date of your retirement approaches. So thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. It is good to be back, in particular to talk about a subject of this importance. And Ranking Member Smith, it's good to see you back in the fight. Personally, I know you've been in the fight from a distance. And other members of the committee, I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning to discuss the increasing disorder and the military component of our strategy in the Middle East. The Middle East is unpredictable, unstable, and increasingly complex, but our goals are quite straightforward. We seek a region that is inhospitable to our enemies and that promotes and protects our core national interests. I characterize the current environment in the Middle East in terms of 3 converging sets of complexity. First, several governments are struggling for political legitimacy because they are not sufficiently pluralistic, or they are not sufficiently accountable to their citizens. Iraq, for example, is still working toward a national unity government. Second, the centuries-old Sunni-Shia rivalry has come to the fore. Weak states are less able to assert independence amid the tug-of-war between sectarian regional powers. And third, internal to Islam, we see rising competition between moderate elements and radical elements, and into that space fits ISIL and others. These three challenges, as they intersect, make for an environment that will test the resolve of the region's security forces. Enduring stability cannot be imposed from the outside in. Stability must be cultivated from the inside out, and importantly, owned by regional stakeholders. Positive transformation of the region will be achieved over time by, with, and through our regional partners. Within this context, the role the United States military is taking against the trans-regional threat of ISIL represents, in my judgment, an appropriate level of effort. I'd underscore, as Secretary Carter also emphasized, that the military is one component of a much broader strategy. Military power alone will not solve this. I don't think anyone in here would disagree with that. We own two lines of effort of 9. Our two lines of effort, one is kinetic, the combination of airstrikes and ISR to enable Iraqi security forces, and the other, which is actually the centerpiece of our military strategy, is the train and equip mission. The 9 lines of effort should be considered in the aggregate. This campaign focuses on building partners who are taking responsibility for their own security. As I've said before, this is an Iraq-first strategy enabled by the coalition, but not an Iraq-only one, and again, certainly not a military-only one. We continue to pressure ISIL in Syria and to actively reinforce and harden our partners in the region. I'd also like to emphasize that we are at the beginning of a complex, nonlinear campaign that will require a sustained level of effort over an extended period of time to promote durable regional stability over the long term. We are constantly evaluating our approach and making sure we're resourcing it appropriately, balanced with our many other global commitments. Let me again thank this committee for what you do every day to support our men and women in uniform and their families who are serving around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Secretary, let me just follow up on what General Dempsey said. A primary line of effort of the department is this train and equip mission. Is it your judgment that 450 more folks, not all of whom will be trainers, some are security and so forth, but are these 450 more folks going to tip the balance to make that train and equip mission successful?
The move into Khartoum, the numbers are not as significant as the location. It's in the heart of Sunni territory, and I think it will make a big difference in the performance of the train and equip program as regards recruiting Sunni fighters. We're actually seeing that in the days since we established that presence there. Also, the Anbar Operations Center of the Iraqi Security Forces is located at Al-Taqaddum, and another function of those people being there, doesn't take a lot of people, but is highly leveraged, is to be in the Anbar Operations Center with the Iraqi forces so that we can help them with their command and control, planning, and discipline. So those are the purposes, those are the benefits of the move to Khartoum. It is necessary, it's not sufficient, but it's necessary to get Sunni forces into the fight in a way so that they are motivated as well as trained and equipped, and that's its purpose, Mr. Chairman.
So what's the reasonable time period for us to check back and see whether this is working as we hope?
I honestly think it's reasonable for you to ask in weeks because we're already getting an inflow of Sunni fighters. We'll put them through the training program. We have the capacity to do that. As I mentioned in my testimony, we have had unused capacity in our train and equip sites in parts of Iraq over the last several months because the Iraqi government hasn't furnished us with paid recruits. Now that is turning around. It has to stay turned around for us to have success in Anbar and elsewhere in Sunni parts of Iraq.
Let me ask one other question. As you mentioned, I think a lot of members will have questions about the ISIS fight. I want to ask about the strategy to deal with Iranian influence outside the nuclear talks. So we'll set the nuclear talks for aside. I mentioned in my opening statement these press reports about the Iranians equipping and paying the Taliban, who are fighting us and our allies in Afghanistan. We know that they are providing tremendous support to the Houthis in the civil war, or whatever one wants to call it, that's going on in Yemen. They are the primary force propping up Assad in Syria. They continue to have a presence in Lebanon, which is not good. What is the administration strategy for dealing with Iranian influence other than the nuclear talks?
Thank you. And Iranian malign influence in the region is the other major challenge to our strategy in the Middle East besides ISIL. So those two stand above others. And I think I would go back to the foundation there, which is the checking that malign influence and defending our ally Israel and our keeping our security commitments to our Gulf partners who were here in town a few weeks ago is the reason why there are 35,000 U.S. forces based in the Middle East. It's to provide that foundation of security for our friends and allies and to check Iranian malign influence, which, as you indicated, one sees them seeking Iraq we've just been talking about, but it's not just in Iraq. It's elsewhere around the region. So it is another very significant challenge for us, and it really is the reason why we are postured in the way we are in the Middle East. The chairman just got back from Israel, by the way, and he's been working with our Israeli partners on exactly those kinds of checks.
Well, I appreciate the fact we've got folks over there. I still haven't heard quite an approach because it seems to me like their influence is expanding, and I'm not sure we're dealing with it. I'll yield to Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chairman and I met last week with the Sunni leader of the Iraqi parliament, and one of the things he said during our meeting that surprised me a little bit as we were talking about the difficulty of getting broader support from the Baghdad government and sort of shifting focus to where could the Sunnis in that path between sort of Anbar and up into Syria, where ISIL is most dominant. And he expressed disappointment, frankly, that the other Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, or even Turkey to go up north, did not seem to really be willing to provide much support, even Jordan as well, for the Sunnis in that area. Number one is, do you agree with that assessment? I tend to take this guy at his word. And number two, why? It would seem to me that defeating ISIL is something that would be very, very important to Saudi Arabia amongst the others there. Why aren't they doing more to help those groups that want to resist ISIS in that part of Iraq and Syria?
That's a critical question, and it goes back to something you said in your opening statement about other Sunni and Arab forces countering ISIL. And I, too, met with Mr. Jabouri last week, who said the same thing. And I think he was speaking on behalf of a number of the Sunni forces, political forces in western Iraq who would like to see more support and recognize, as I think you noted and the chairman noted in their opening statement, that Americans and Westerners can lead and enable, but if they get too high a profile, that becomes a problem in its own right.
Exactly.
Therefore, all the more reason to get others Sunnis involved in the fight. Now, one thing I'll note is the heads of state of the GCC were here in Washington, and we went to Camp David about 3 weeks ago. And I would say that this was one of the major themes of our conversations with them. The other one being, to get back to what the chairman said, checking Iranian malign influence, which they're also concerned about. Their concern about ISIL is genuine, but their actions, I think, can be greatly strengthened. And that was one of the principal things we talked about, getting them in the train and equip program.
Yeah,
Sorry?
Yeah, I got all that, but why? Why isn't, I mean, what in your opinion, having worked with these people, why isn't it happening?
Well, one reason is that they simply lack the capacity. And so we talked a lot about building special operations forces that had counter, as opposed to air forces. We have enough air forces. We're looking for ground forces. And capable ground forces is one that are skilled in counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and so forth.
And that's one of the key questions. Sorry to interrupt. But that's where we've got to go, and that's where, you know, we've got this fight. We had this fight in the Senate and also on the House side over whether or not to directly arm the Kurds, to basically skip the Baghdad government and just get the forces, the people who are actually fighting, and in some cases fighting successfully. You know, shouldn't we be shifting a lot of our focus to that and basically saying to Baghdad, time's up. You know, you've got your relationship with Iran, with the Shia militias. Doesn't seem to be much we can do about that. You continually push the Sunnis out. We got to shift our resources to people. I mean, you mentioned it. We expected 24,000 Iraqis. You got 7,000. I mean, at what point do we shift the strategy? And believe me, I understand the implications of that. You know, the concern is about the fracturing of Iraq. But as I have said many times before, that cow has left the barn. Iraq is fractured. You can make a pretty powerful argument, in fact, that Iraq is no more. So when do we shift that strategy and start building the capabilities of other partners who will fight?
Well, sectarianism in Iraq is the principal factor that brought us to where Iraq is in ISIL. It was Prime Minister Maliki and his relentlessly partisan or sectarian manner of governance. Now, we have in the Prime Minister Abadi, with whom I've met, and the chairman may have met also, but certainly mentioned, someone who I believe is genuinely committed to behaving in a decentralized, federalized, if you like, but multi-sectarian single state. Personally, he's dedicated to that.
Yes.
I think the chairman asked the question, does his writ run throughout Iraq? And that's what we are waiting to see. In the meantime, we are arming the Kurds. We are arming the Sunnis. We do it in coordination with the Iraqi government, but in a way that doesn't delay, as it was a few months ago, that assistance to them. But we're still doing it through the government of Iraq because we're still trying to support the Prime Minister in maintaining a decentralized but single unitary Iraqi state.
And just a quick thing on Iran. And obviously, I mean, if we just had these extremist Sunni groups to fight, I mean, that would be enough to really challenge us. But then when you throw in Iranian influence and how it you know, stirs up the region, it definitely creates a higher level problem. But I do just want to make the observation, as awful as Iran is, number one, this isn't really necessarily helping them to have to fight multiple wars outside of their own borders, to have to fight in Syria, to fight in Iraq, to fight in Yemen. That can be draining, as we well know. So there's a negative influence on them as well. And whatever one may say about Iran, the difference between them and ISIL wants to kill it. They wake up every morning, you know, anxious to kill as many Americans as possible. So as we're balancing this, it's a very difficult balance to make. You know, defeating ISIL, I think, should be at the top of that list of concerns. That's just an observation. As bad as Iran is, and trying to figure out some way to get them to stop having that malign influence, all for it. But I think we really need to have our #1 focus, not just, again, on ISIL, but on that brighter ideology that motivates people to attack us. Final quick question. There have been some reports that, you know, the Assad government is weakening. Where do you assess the chances that they might just fall? That Assad might, you know, he is unable to replace many of the troops that he's losing now. Is it possible that Assad just up and leaves because of how bad things are going? And then what?
Two observations on that, and then the chairman may want to comment on that as well. I mean, first of all, we would like to see a transition in which Assad disappeared from the scene, so that his regime as another source of fuel for extremism is eliminated. That is, it is possible because his forces are much weakened. And they have taken great losses. They're having trouble. Their forces and their reserves are depleted, and they are increasingly isolated in the Damascus area and in the Alawite areas of northwestern Syria. I think the last thing I'd say, Congressman Smith, is that the best way for the Syrian people for this to go would be for him to remove himself from the scene, and there to be created, difficult as that will be, a new government of Syria based on the moderate opposition that we have been trying to build and support, and then helping them strengthen themselves and to retake all of Syrian territory. That would be a desirable path if he did was removed from the scene or removed himself from the scene.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ranking Member Smith. That was the purpose of my trip to the region, actually, was to discuss with regional partners a scenario in which the regime would either collapse or Assad would depart for one reason or another. And it's generally the consensus there that in the near term it's probably more likely that the regime would would go over to the defensive and limit its protection of the Alawite, Shia, and some of the minority groups, leaving the rest of Syria essentially ungoverned or governed in ways that wouldn't be positive for the region in the near term. And so we're working with our partners on the near term.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, the country owes you a great deal of gratitude, but I only have 5 minutes, so I'm just going to say thank you for all that you've done for us. And, Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. We're talking about policy and strategy in the Middle East. And one thing that I find a little disconcerting from people I talk to is when we find individuals who have held your job in the past as Secretary of Defense who indicate, rightly or wrongly, that the President's heart may not always be in some of our military operations. It's also disconcerting when we hear the President, rightly or wrongly, suggest that we may have no winning strategy in the Middle East. But it's also disconcerting as a committee. We're not always in the policy and strategy business, but we're in the resourcing and capability business here. And we look at just some of the gaps we have. We know that we're going to have a gap this year for our carriers, where we will have certain regions of the world that will not have a carrier presence for weeks when we perhaps need one or two. We also know that in 2007, the Navy was able to meet 90% of our COCOM validated requirements. This year, we'll only meet 44%. We've had testimony from the Air Force that they currently have the oldest and the smallest Air Force since the history of the Air Force, and that less than 50% of their combat squadrons are fully combat capable. So this committee, on a very bipartisan basis, has worked very, very hard to try to close some of those gaps, to reach some of the numbers that you need. We voted out an NDAA bill, 269 to 151. This committee voted it out 60 to 2. We have passed a defense appropriations bill, 278 to 149. By all likelihood, it looks like a conference report will come out and those bills will be before the President in September of this year. You probably know we have 12 appropriations bills. The first one up before the President will probably be the defense bills, and the President will have 11 days to sign them. Now, you were kind enough on an unsolicited basis the last time you were here to suggest to us what your recommendation would be to the President about vetoing bills. Now that you actually have a real bill to look at and to analyze, which helps fill some of those gaps, can you tell us whether or not you would recommend that the President veto that bill if it's substantially the same bill that has passed on a bipartisan basis out of the House, both on the NDAA and the approach bill?
Thank you, Congressman. And let me just second what you said about the chairman. He's been my battle buddy now for a number of years, as I had various jobs, and he was chairman, before that Chief of Staff of the Army, and I'm very much going to miss him. It's been terrific. You're absolutely right about resources. We cannot continue to be the world's finest fighting force if we don't get a budget a budget picture and horizon in front of us. I haven't changed my view from last time I saw you. I really fervently hope, and this isn't something I'm skilled in, and I won't be part of the deliberations within the Congress, but I fervently hope that everybody can come together, both parties.
Mr. Secretary, I don't want to cut you off. I just have a minute and some left. Here's my point. We don't always get to pick the bills we hope that we can have. I'm saying if a bill comes substantially the same as the NDAA bill and the defense approach bill that passed the House, would you recommend to the President that he sign that bill or that he veto that bill?
The President's already said that he's going to veto the bill.
No, I'm asking your recommendation because you gave us a recommendation.
I support that.
So you would recommend that he veto those bills?
He has already determined that he's going to veto the bill.
But you would recommend that?
I want...
Now, let me ask you this. Have you done an analysis of the risk that would put to national defense? Because the result of that would be that you'd get at least $25 billion less.
Let me describe the risk that going 1 year at a time in budgeting.
No, I'm just asking the difference
I know what you're asking, but I would like
to you're not prepared to ask that.
A sort of herky-jerky approach to our budget is. It's managerially harmful to do things
Mr. Secretary, you will have $25 billion short if that bill fails, but you would still take that risk. And by the way, that risk would put us, according to General Dempsey, at a place where we would be below the minimum edge of what we need for our national security. And let me just end up, Mr. Chairman, by saying this. I think it is unimaginable that we would send 450 troops into harm's way and still look their families in the eye and tell them and their families we'd veto a bill that would get them the resources they need. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Time gentleman's expired. Ms. Davis.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to reiterate that I haven't changed my view. We need a multi-year defense budget. We have a strategy that is a long-term strategy. We have people, the very people that Congressman Ford just referred to, who have careers, who want to know what their future is going to be. And this business where we have a budget 1 year at a time, and I'm not blaming anybody for it. I realize it's a collective thing where our country needs to rise up and get it together in this area. I'm just telling you it's very damaging to the institution that I feel responsible for and am responsible for. And the other thing I'd say is I travel around the world, and this looks terrible. It gives the appearance that we are diminishing ourselves because we can't come together behind a budget year in and year out. And so I continue to hope and believe that we can come together behind an agreed budget that has a multi-year horizon and allows us to plan and execute programs and recruit and retain people in the way that I think we need to do. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, I don't disagree with anything you just said. When we vote, it's yes or no. And I think that's the point on the veto. It's a yes or no. And so that's the thing that I think is concerning to me. Ms. Davis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. And, of course, General Dempsey, I greatly appreciate your service and all you've contributed. And I think, you know, there's obviously controversy and concern about your response. I appreciate the fact that it is a direct response and that we'd like everyone actually to get to yes on this one. And we have to work harder on it. So thank you very much. I wanted to first just ask about what you talked about as the first critical line of effort really here, which, as you say, is a political one. And my concern is that with limited security that we have, I'm not sure that the State Department, even if they had the resources, and I think we could, you know, that's obviously a very great concern, if they're really able to do their job in Iraq. So I'd like you to respond to that. And along with that really does go the fourth line, which is how we communicate and whether we were doing that effectively. Those are two important things. And the third thing I just wanted to ask you about briefly is, you know, the issue about resources. And you mentioned the fact that we need to expedite delivery of equipment, that we weren't doing a good job with that. I think my question is, why did that take so long? There are issues around certainly Baghdad, as you mentioned, but within our own policies as well. What are we learning from that so that that really doesn't happen in the future? Thank you, sir. Thank you, General.
Thank you. On the political front, which really means trying to support Prime Minister Abadi and the government of Iraq to govern in a way that it can collect in support from Sunnis, collect in support from Kurds, and collect in support from Shiites who are not affiliated with or directly supported by Iran, and create an Iraqi security force that can defeat ISIL and turn Iraq into a place where people can live in a decent way. That is an essential task, and we need to align that very closely with the military line, which is why I mentioned that Secretary Kerry, who's just come back into town, and I are meeting, and our teams are meeting specifically to make sure that those lines of effort, our two and his, are synchronized. Messaging. I'd only make one note about messaging, which is an area where I think we are unnecessarily hobbling ourselves. We, for example, had a website, CENTCOM had a website which simply described the facts of our campaign and what was going on. It was tuned for an audience in the region so that they could come to a website and learn about what we were doing. So we were telling the truth, but we were denied the authority to operate that. And told that that was not an appropriate thing for the Department of Defense to be doing. I'd like to be able to have that authority. With respect to
training, sir, I'm sorry, denied the authority from?
By Congress.
Okay.
With respect to training and equipping, this is one of these situations where there's plenty of responsibility to pass around, and I wouldn't put it all on the Iraqis, and I wouldn't put it all on us, and I wouldn't put it all on Congress and all on the Pentagon. But let me just tell you what happened. Since you passed the money for 2015, the appropriations bill in December. The money came out in January, went through whatever OMB processed, and then there was in your bill the requirement that we only spend 25% of it until we reported in the last 75%. We met that requirement. That really, I can't say, was the limiting step. The limiting step for us to expend that money was building the training sites. What we did do in the meantime, while we were waiting for that money, is reach into all kinds of other pots we have, excess defense articles and so forth. And so we tried to fill the gap. Now the gap's closed now and that money is flowing. But it wasn't all on the Iraqi side, although they were an impediment, particularly when it came to arming Sunnis and Kurds. The government in Baghdad didn't want us to do that. But anyway, we're back on our feet now, but I'm not going to try to excuse something that took longer than it should have.
Thank you. And just quickly, with the 2 seconds left I have, on the resources that the Secretary, Kerry, and the State Department are going to have, and the backup security, I just want to be sure that we get a full answer on that. Thank you.
I'd be happy to provide that.
Mr. Secretary, both Mr. Smith and I'd be very interested to know, or to have you follow up, who denied CENTCOM the ability to put up a website with the facts, and on what basis they denied it. He and I have worked for some years to update some of the outdated restrictions on these sorts of issues, and we are very interested in fixing this problem if part of the problem is with this branch of government.
Thank you.
So if you'd ask your lawyers to do that,
Absolutely.
It's very
Thank you
important.
very much.
Chairman Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. I was looking at the preparation sheet here for today's hearing, and it says this is a reference, quote, United States policy and strategy in the Middle East, and I think we've concluded that we don't have a strategy. In fact, the